Welcome to Moonlit Inc. BL. A BL story written under moonlight. Let's begin. Chapter 1, The Bill Comes Due. The carriage did not have a heater, and the Hudson family crest, a proud, golden hawk, had been crudely scraped from the door panels with a dull blade. It was a fitting metaphor, Evander thought, huddling into his thin wool coat. He was no longer a hawk. He was a pound of flesh, packaged and shipped to settle a tab. The journey toward the northern peaks of the Gibson Duchy took 3 days. With every mile, the vibrant greens of the lowlands bled into a skeletal, monochromatic gray. By the time the iron gates of the Blackwood Manor groaned open, the world was nothing but white frost and jagged stone. Out, the driver grunted, not bothering to lower the steps. Evander stumbled onto the frozen gravel. His boots, polished to a mirror shine by a valet he no longer owned, cracked against the ice. Before him stood the manor, a sprawling, Gothic monolith that seemed to swallow the dim afternoon light. There was no welcoming committee. No line of servants. Only a single, towering man in a charcoal livery stood by the heavy oak doors. His face was a mask of professional indifference. "Master Evander Hudson?" the man asked. His voice was as dry as parchment. "I am," Evander replied, trying to keep his chin level despite the way his teeth wanted to chatter. He reached for the small leather valise at his feet, but the driver was already whipping the horses, turning the carriage back toward the warmth of the south without a second glance. "The Duke does not care for luggage," the servant said, looking at the bag. "He finds the remnants of a previous life distracting. Leave it." Evander flinched. "It only contains a few books. A locket from my—" "Leave it." The finality in the man's tone felt like a physical blow. With a shaking hand, Evander let the handle slip from his fingers. The valise sat lonely on the ice as he was led inside. The interior of the manor was a tomb of silent luxury. Deep velvet rugs muffled his footsteps, and the air smelled of beeswax and cold ozone. They climbed a spiral staircase of black marble that seemed to lead into the very throat of the mountain. "These are your quarters," the servant said, stopping before a heavy door at the end of a drafty corridor. The room was vast and terrifyingly empty. There was a bed with slate-gray linens, a single chair, and a fireplace that held no wood. The windows were narrow slits, offering a view of nothing but the swirling blizzard outside. "Where is my family?" Evander asked, his voice cracking. "My father said the Duke would discuss the terms of the debt upon my arrival." The servant paused, his hand on the door handle. "The debt is settled, Master Hudson. Your father signed the papers an hour after you departed. You are no longer a guest, nor a negotiator." The man stepped out and closed the door. The click of the lock was soft, but in the silence of the frost-bitten hall, it sounded like a guillotine blade hitting the block. Evander walked to the center of the room and sank to his knees. He caught his reflection in the darkened windowpane, pale skin, hazel eyes wide with a terror he couldn't hide, and that small beauty mark on his lower lip trembling. He was 21 years old, a noble by blood, and he had just been sold to a man who didn't even deem him worthy of a fire to keep him warm. He stayed there until the sun vanished, wrapped in the crushing silence of the Duke's shadow. Chapter 2, The First Glimpse of the Monster. The 3 days of isolation were a psychological flame. Evander was fed in silence, trays of cold bread and thin broth slipped through a small slot at the base of the door. There was no fire, only the oppressive weight of heavy furs that smelled of cedar and old dust. He spent the hours tracing the beauty mark on his lip with a trembling finger, the only part of himself that still felt familiar in this tomb of black stone. On the 4th morning, the door didn't just click, it swung wide. "His Grace will see you now," the servant said. There was no request in the tone, only a command. Evander's legs were stiff as he was led through the labyrinthine corridors. The manor felt larger than it had on the first day, a ribcage of stone designed to protect a cold heart. They reached a set of double doors carved from dark obsidian. As they opened, a wall of dry, shivering heat hit Evander's face. The study was bathed in a dim, flickering amber light from a massive hearth. Standing by a floor-to-ceiling window, silhouetted against the raging white blizzard outside, was a figure that seemed carved from the mountain itself. "Leave us," a voice commanded. It wasn't the roar of a monster, but something far more unsettling, a low, melodic baritone that vibrated in the marrow of Evander's bones. The servant vanished. The heavy doors thudded shut. For a long minute, the man did not turn. Evander stood in the center of the rug, his hands knotted behind his back to hide their shaking. The silence stretched until it was paper-thin. "Come closer, Evander Hudson." Evander moved, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. As he stepped into the light of the hearth, the Duke finally turned. Kieran Gibson was a study in monochromatic elegance. His skin was a shade paler than Evander's, the translucent white of a frozen lake. His hair, the color of silver ash, was swept back from a sharp, aristocratic brow. But it was his eyes that stopped the air in Evander's lungs, deep-set, tapered, and a gray so piercing they looked like polished flint. Kieran didn't speak. He simply stared, his gaze traveling slowly from the top of Evander's messy brown hair down to his scuffed boots. It wasn't a look of lust, it was the look of a jeweler appraising a diamond he had bought for a pittance. "You are smaller than the portraits," Kieran remarked, his voice devoid of warmth. "The portraits were painted when I was a child, Your Grace," Evander managed to whisper, his voice raspy from days of disuse. "Before my father decided I was a currency." Kieran took a step forward. The height difference was staggering. He smelled of winter air and expensive tobacco. He reached out, his fingers cold as he hooked them under Evander's chin, forcing his head up. "Look at me," Kieran commanded. Evander forced his hazel eyes to meet that terrifying gray. Up close, Kieran's intensity was a physical weight. The Duke's thumb moved, dragging slowly across the curve of Evander's lower lip, stopping right over the dark beauty mark. Kieran's eyes darkened, a flicker of something, hunger, or perhaps a deep, possessive curiosity, breaking the ice in his expression. "You are mine now," Kieran murmured, his thumb pressing firmly enough to bruise the delicate skin. "The Hudsons have no claim to your breath or your blood. Do you understand what that means, little bird?" Evander swallowed hard, the movement of his throat brushing against Kieran's cold palm. "It means I am your prisoner." "No," Kieran said, a ghost of a cruel smile touching his lips. "Prisoners have rights. You have only me." Chapter 3, Stripped of Dignity. The transition from a noble to a servant was not a sudden fall, but a slow, agonizing erosion. The morning air in the Duke's wing was sharp enough to sting the lungs. Evander stood by the heavy mahogany washstand, his fingers numb as he tested the temperature of the water. He wore a simple, unadorned white linen shirt, his fine silk tunics had been misplaced by the staff on Kieran's orders. The door to the bedchamber creaked open, and the Duke emerged from the shadows of his four-poster bed. He was shirtless, his broad shoulders and pale chest mapped with faint, silvery lines that looked like lightning caught under the skin. "The water is ready, Your Grace," Evander said, keeping his eyes lowered. "Lather the soap, Evander," Kieran commanded. He sat in a high-backed velvet chair, tilting his head back to expose the sharp, lethal line of his throat. Evander's breath hitched. He had never held a straight razor in his life, let alone used one on a man who could have him discarded in the snow with a single word. He approached with trembling hands, the silver brush heavy in his palm. As he applied the warm foam to Kieran's jaw, the Duke's gray eyes remained open, tracking every flicker of emotion on Evander's face. The proximity was suffocating. Evander could feel the radiant heat coming off Kieran's body, a startling contrast to the icy demeanor he projected. "Your hands are shaking," Kieran noted, his voice a low vibration that Evander felt in his own chest. "Are you afraid you'll cut me, or afraid of what happens if you don't?" "I was taught to command servants, not to be one," Evander whispered, his hazel eyes flashing with a spark of his old defiance. Kieran's hand shot out, wrapping around Evander's wrist with the force of a manacle. He pulled him forward until Evander was forced to stumble between the Duke's knees. "That life is dead," Kieran murmured. He reached up with his free hand, his long fingers trailing down the front of Evander's thin shirt. A Hudson is a creature of pride. But a debt is a creature of subjection. You are here to learn that your dignity is a luxury you can no longer afford. Kieran's grip tightened on his wrist, pulling him even closer until their chests nearly brushed. Down. On your knees. Finish the task from there. The humiliation was a physical weight, heavier than the cold stone of the manor. Evander's face burned a deep crimson. For a moment, he considered throwing the porcelain bowl at the Duke's feet and screaming. But then he remembered his father's cold signature on the bill of sale. He had nowhere to run. Slowly, agonizingly, Evander sank to the floor. From this vantage point, he felt utterly small. He had to reach up to continue his work, his arms aching as he meticulously shaved the Duke's face. Kieran looked down at him, his expression unreadable, though his thumb began to absent-mindedly stroke the pulse point on Evander's captured wrist. Good, Kieran whispered as the final stroke of the blade cleared the foam. You learn quickly when the frost bites, little bird. Evander looked up, his eyes glassy with unshed tears of shame. Kieran didn't look away, instead, he reached down and wiped a stray fleck of foam from Evander's lower lip, his touch lingering on the beauty mark with a terrifying, possessive heat. Chapter 4, The Heat in the Hearth. The sky outside didn't just turn gray, it vanished entirely, swallowed by a screaming white void. The wind howled against the stone battlements of the Gibson estate like a physical beast trying to claw its way in. Inside, the ancient pipes of the guest wing gave a final, metallic shriek before falling silent. The heat was gone. Evander sat huddled on his bed, wrapped in 3 layers of heavy wool, his breath blossoming in front of his face in thick, ghostly clouds. His fingers were blue at the tips, and the beauty mark on his lip felt like a frozen pebble against his skin. A sharp rap at the door made him flinch. The towering servant from the first day stood there, silhouetted by the dim hallway light. The guest wing's hearths have failed, Master Hudson. His Grace has commanded you to move to the Master's suite immediately. The central flues are the only ones still drawing. Evander didn't argue. The primitive instinct for survival outweighed his dread of the Duke. Kieran's private chambers were a sanctuary of oppressive warmth. A fire roared in a hearth large enough to stand in, casting long, flickering shadows that danced across the black silk wallpaper. Kieran was seated at a desk, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, his silver ash hair glowing like foxfire in the firelight. Sit, Kieran said without looking up from his ledger. He gestured toward a low velvet chaise near the fire. Evander sank into the cushions, the sudden heat making his frozen skin prickle with painful intensity. For an hour, the only sound was the scratching of Kieran's quill and the rhythmic lash of snow against the glass. The forced proximity felt like a tightening wire. You're shivering, Kieran remarked. He stood, his movements fluid and predatory, and walked toward the hearth. I'll be fine, Your Grace, Evander whispered, pulling his knees to his chest. Kieran didn't listen. He reached down, his large, pale hand catching Evander by the shoulder. The heat radiating from the Duke was almost unnatural. Your skin is like marble. If you freeze to death, you're of no use to me. He didn't just adjust the blankets, he sat on the edge of the chaise, his heavy thigh pressing against Evander's hip. The intimacy was jarring. Kieran reached out, his thumb tracing the line of Evander's jaw before settling, as it always did, on the beauty mark. But this time, Kieran's touch was different. It wasn't just a claim of ownership. His fingers were trembling, a microscopic tremor that betrayed a crack in his icy facade. Why do you look at me like that? Kieran murmured, his gray eyes searching Evander's hazel ones with a desperate, hidden hunger. As if you're waiting for the blow. You bought me, Kieran, Evander said, using the Duke's name for the first time, his voice bold with the recklessness of the cold. One does not expect kindness from a creditor. Kieran's gaze dropped to Evander's mouth. The monster of the north leaned in, his breath warm against Evander's chilled skin. Perhaps, Kieran hissed, his voice dropping to a gravelly low, I didn't buy you to break you. Perhaps I bought you because you're the only thing in this world that doesn't look like ash to me. For a heartbeat, the possessive heat between them threatened to eclipse the fire in the hearth. Kieran didn't pull away, and for the first time, Evander didn't lean back. Chapter 5, A Taste of Obsession. The blizzard had turned the world outside into a sensory void, but inside the Duke's bedchamber, the air was thick, heavy with the scent of sandalwood and the sharp tang of static electricity. Evander stood behind Kieran, his fingers fumbling with the intricate silver buttons of the Duke's formal waistcoat. It was a task that should have been simple, but the heat radiating from Kieran's broad back made Evander's vision swim. Every time his knuckles brushed the fine silk of Kieran's shirt, a jolt of electricity raced up his arms. "You're lingering, Evander," Kieran said. He didn't turn around, but his voice carried a low, rhythmic thrum that centered in Evander's gut. "The buttons are stubborn, Your Grace," Evander lied, his voice breathless. In truth, it was his own heart that was stubborn. He found himself staring at the nape of Kieran's neck, where the silver ash hair met the pale, flawless skin. Without thinking, his hand strayed. His fingertips grazed the cool column of Kieran's throat, a touch so light it was barely there. The reaction was instantaneous. Kieran spun around with predatory speed. Before Evander could gasp, he was backed against the heavy oak wardrobe, the air huffed out of him as Kieran's massive frame pinned him into the wood. The Duke's hands slammed against the wardrobe on either side of Evander's head, trapping him in a cage of muscle and expensive wool. "Do not play games with a man who has forgotten how to laugh," Kieran hissed. His gray eyes were no longer like flint, they were like molten lead, burning with a terrifying, singular focus. "I wasn't." "You were," Kieran interrupted, leaning in until their noses brushed. "You've been watching me. Since the moment you arrived, you've been searching for the monster. Tell me, little bird, have you found him yet?" Evander's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He looked up, his hazel eyes wide and swimming with a mix of fear and an inexplicable, rising heat. "I found a man who bought a soul to fill a vacuum." "Is that the monster?" Kieran's expression fractured. The cold mask didn't just slip, it shattered. He grabbed Evander's jaw, not with the clinical grip of a master, but with the desperate hunger of a drowning man. His thumb pressed into the beauty mark on Evander's lower lip, dragging it down to reveal the pink sliver of his inner lip. "I didn't just accept the Hudson debt," Kieran confessed, his voice a raw, jagged whisper. "I demanded it. I saw you at the Winter Gala 3 years ago. You were laughing in a garden of dying roses, and I decided then that if I couldn't have light, I would own the sun." The admission was a confession and a threat all at once. Kieran's gaze dropped to Evander's mouth, his pupils blown wide until the gray of his eyes was almost entirely eclipsed by black. "You are not a guest, and you are not a servant," Kieran murmured, his face inches from Evander's. "You are my obsession. And I am a very selfish man." He didn't kiss him, not yet. Instead, he leaned down and pressed his forehead against Evander's, closing his eyes as if inhaling the very essence of the younger man. The possessive heat was no longer a metaphor, it was a physical force, binding the outcast to the Duke in the heart of the storm. Chapter 6, The Hudson Betrayal Returns. The bubble of their private, heated isolation didn't just pop, it was shattered by the shrill, entitled blast of a silver horn at the Manor's frozen gates. Evander was still pinned against the wardrobe, his heart thundering against Kieran's chest, when the heavy oak door to the bedchamber was flung open. The lead servant stood there, his usual composure rattled. "Your Grace, a representative from House Hudson has arrived. He bypassed the perimeter guards. He claims it is a matter of urgent family blood." Kieran didn't move immediately. He stayed leaning into Evander for a heartbeat longer than necessary, his gray eyes searching Evander's hazel ones for a sign of longing. Finding only a flash of cold dread, Kieran straightened his waistcoat, his expression freezing back into a mask of lethal indifference. "Stay here," Kieran commanded. "Kieran, wait," Evander started, but the Duke was already gone, his heavy boots echoing like funeral drums down the hall. Evander didn't stay. The name Hudson felt like a brand on his skin. He followed at a distance, hovering in the shadows of the mezzanine gallery that overlooked the great hall. Below stood Julian Hudson, Evander's older brother. Julian looked ridiculous in the bleak, monochrome hall, dressed in flamboyant silks of peacock blue and smelling of cheap floral perfume that fought against the scent of the Duke's cold ozone. "Duke Gibson." Julian called out, his voice oily and overfamiliar. "I trust my brother has been accommodating. Our father sent me to check on the merchandise, so to speak." Evander flinched, his fingers digging into the stone railing. "Your brother is not merchandise," Kieran's voice rang out, vibrating with a low, dangerous frequency. He stood at the base of the stairs, his silver hair catching the dim light like a blade. "He is the settlement of a debt. A debt that is closed." "Why are you here, Hudson?" Julian chuckled, a sound that made Evander's stomach turn. "Well, you see, the winter was harsher than expected. The gambling dens in the capital were unkind. We thought, seeing as Evander has clearly found his way into your good graces, and likely your bed, that a small maintenance fee might be in order. Surely a man of your vast wealth wouldn't miss a few thousand gold marks for the family that provided such a delicate prize." The silence that followed was suffocating. Evander waited for the rejection, for Kieran to look up at him with disgust, realizing he had bought into a family of leeches. He expected to be tossed back to Julian like a used garment. Instead, Kieran laughed. It was a dry, terrifying sound. "You sold your own blood to pay for your failures," Kieran said, stepping into Julian's personal space. The Duke loomed over him, a mountain of shadow against a peacock. "And now you return to pick the pockets of the man you sold him to." "Now, see here," Julian started, but Kieran grabbed him by the throat, hoisting him nearly off his feet with a strength that seemed impossible. "Listen to me, you pathetic worm," Kieran hissed, his voice carrying up to the gallery where Evander watched with wide eyes. "Evander Hudson died the moment he stepped into this manor. He is no longer your brother. He is no longer a Hudson. He is mine. He belongs to the frost, to the stone, and to me. If you or your father ever set foot on my lands again, I won't send you back. I'll bury you beneath the permafrost where no one will ever find the bones." Kieran flung Julian toward the door. The elder Hudson scrambled to his feet, his face pale with a terror he hadn't expected to feel. He fled into the blizzard without another word. Kieran stood alone in the center of the hall, his chest heaving. He slowly turned his head, looking up toward the mezzanine. His eyes found Evander's. There was no coldness there now. Only a raw, territorial ferocity. He had just burned the last bridge Evander had to the world outside, and for the first time, Evander didn't feel like a prisoner. He felt like a treasure that had finally been claimed by a monster who knew his worth. Chapter 7, From Property to Partner. The power dynamic in the Gibson Manor didn't just shift, it inverted. In the wake of his brother's cowardice, Evander found a strange, jagged kind of steel in his own spine. He was no longer the trembling boy who had arrived in a crestless carriage. He was the only creature in the world who had seen the monster of Gibson show mercy, and he knew exactly how much that mercy had cost Kieran's pride. The following evening, the Duke sat in his study, a map of the Northern Territory spread across his desk. The fire was low, casting deep, flickering hollows into his pale cheeks. He looked exhausted, the weight of his reclusive crown pressing visibly onto his shoulders. Evander entered without knocking. He wasn't carrying a tray of tea or a basin of water. He was dressed in a robe of deep, midnight blue silk, a gift Kieran had left on his bed that morning, and his hair was damp from a hot bath he had drawn for himself. "I didn't summon you, Evander," Kieran said, though he didn't look up. His voice lacked its usual bite, it sounded more like a plea for distance he knew he wouldn't get. "You don't have to," Evander replied, his voice smooth and intentional. He walked behind the Duke's chair, his shadow stretching long across the map. "You told my brother I was yours. Does a man not attend to his own property?" Kieran's hand, resting on the edge of the desk, clenched until his knuckles were white stones. "Do not mock me with your own chains. You know as well as I do that those bars are broken." "Are they?" Evander leaned down, his chest brushing against the back of Kieran's head. He reached out, his fingers tracing the silver ash strands of the Duke's hair before trailing down to the sensitive skin of his ear. "Because I feel more bound to this house now than I ever did when the doors were locked." Kieran finally turned, his grey eyes wide and turbulent. "What do you want from me?" "I saved you from them. I claimed you. Is that not enough for your vengeance?" "I don't want vengeance, Kieran. I want the truth." Evander stepped around the chair and sank onto the Duke's lap. It was a bold, scandalous move that would have seen a servant whipped and a noble disgraced. Kieran froze. His breath hitched, his hands hovering mid-air as if he were afraid that touching Evander would cause the younger man to shatter, or worse, to vanish. "The scars," Evander whispered, his hazel eyes fixed on the Duke's. He reached for the collar of Kieran's shirt, his fingers nimbler than they had been during the shaving ritual. "The reason you hide in this frost. The reason you bought a soul instead of courting a wife. Show me." For a long minute, the only sound was the crackle of the dying embers. Then, with a low, defeated groan, Kieran reached up and undid the remaining buttons himself. He pushed the fabric back, revealing the marks Evander had only glimpsed in the firelight before. They weren't just scars, they were intricate, glowing brands that pulsed with a faint, rhythmic light, a family curse that bound the Gibson bloodline to the very stone of the mountains. "I am a gargoyle in a man's skin, Evander," Kieran hissed, his eyes filling with a rare, crystalline vulnerability. "I am cold because the mountain demands my heat to keep the peaks frozen. I am reclusive because I am a freak of nature. Now, tell me how much you despise your buyer." Evander didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned forward and pressed a lingering, soft kiss to the glowing brand over Kieran's heart. Then, he looked up, his thumb grazing his own beauty mark before pressing it against Kieran's lips. "I don't see a monster," Evander whispered, feeling the Duke's massive arms finally wrap around him, pulling him in with a desperate, crushing strength. "I see a man who has been lonely for far longer than I have been an outcast. And I think I'd like to see what happens if I never leave." The property had become the master, and the Duke was more than happy to surrender. Chapter 8, The Weight of the Blood Debt. The morning of the winter solstice arrived not with a scream of wind, but with a terrifying, absolute silence. The blizzard had finally spent its rage, leaving the Gibson estate buried under a pristine, glittering shroud of white. Inside the master suite, the air was warm, smelling of spent cedar and the intimate, lingering scent of skin. Evander woke to the sensation of Kieran's gaze. The Duke was propped up on one elbow, his silver ash hair messy against the black silk pillows, watching Evander with an intensity that had shifted from predatory to profoundly protective. Without a word, Kieran reached for a heavy, wax-sealed parchment resting on the bedside table. "The blood debt. Today is the anniversary of the contract signing," Kieran said, his voice husky with sleep. He sat up, the glowing brands on his chest dimming in the morning light as if the presence of the man in his arms offered a temporary peace to the curse. "By the laws of the North, the debt is considered satisfied today. You have served your time. You have endured the isolation." Kieran held the paper out. A heavy iron letter opener lay beside it. "The carriage is already being readied," Kieran continued, though his jaw tightened as he spoke the words. "It is unbranded. There is a chest in the foyer with enough gold to ensure you never have to look at a Hudson, or a Gibson, ever again. You are free, Evander. Truly free." Evander looked at the parchment. This was the moment he had prayed for in those first 3 days of frozen isolation. He looked at the signature of the father who had sold him and the brother who had tried to pimp him. Then, he looked at the man holding the paper. Evander took the contract, but he didn't reach for the letter opener. He stood, his bare feet padding softly across the cold stone floor toward the hearth. He took a match, struck it, and held the flame to the corner of the heavy vellum. Kieran stood up, his brow furrowing. Evander? What are you doing? Settling the debt, Evander replied. He watched as the fire hungrily climbed the page, turning the names and the legalities into curling black flakes. He tossed the burning remains into the grate, watching until the last evidence of his subjection was nothing but ash and smoke. Evander turned back to the Duke. I was sold as a slave, Kieran. If I leave now, I leave as a victim of a debt. But if I stay... He walked back to the Duke, stepping into the circle of his arms and looking up into those stormy grey eyes. If I stay, it is because I chose a monster over a family of ghosts. It is because I would rather be the obsession of a king than the burden of a beggar. Kieran's breath hitched. He reached out, his large hand cupping Evander's face with a reverence that bordered on the holy. His thumb traced the beauty mark on Evander's lip, no longer checking a mark of ownership, but tracing a feature he adored. You would stay in the cold? Kieran whispered. In the silence? The silence isn't so bad, Evander said, a small, genuine smile tugging at his lips, when I can hear your heart beating against mine. Kieran didn't wait for another word. He crushed his lips to Evander's, a kiss that tasted of freedom and fire. The contract was gone, the debt was dead, and in the heart of the frost-bitten north, a new lineage was beginning, one built not on blood and gold, but on a dark, beautiful choice. The outcast had finally found his home, and the Duke had finally found his soul.